Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome and to everyone for today's webinar titled The Spirit is Alive, Fostering Spiritual Well-Being Among People Living with Dementia with Dr. Kelly O'Shea Carney. I'm Andrew Andresco, Project Coordinator for Transforming Chaplaincy, and we are delighted you could all join us. We had over 300 registrants this morning for an event that was announced just under 2 weeks ago, so we couldn't be more thrilled. Obviously, that's indicative that the topic is right on everyone's mind, is important. But I'd like to make some housekeeping instructions off the top. You are listening in using your computer speaker system by default and are muted. Should you have any technical questions regarding your audio or visual, please type those into the chat box located in your platform's dashboard. You'll also have the opportunity to submit questions, typing those into the questions box of that same control panel. And if we have time at the end of today's session, we'll have a Q&A session and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. George Fitchett, Director of Transforming Chaplaincy. And George, it's all yours.
Thanks, Andy. Appreciate all your good work. Friends, Transforming Chaplaincy is really excited to launch the Elder Care Research Network. Many chaplains work with older adults in a variety of facilities, long-term care facilities and others, and we're really eager to help you strengthen the spiritual care that you provide by using research. And I'm really delighted today to be able to introduce the conveners of the new Transforming Chaplaincy Elder Care Research Network. One of our conveners is Dr. Catherine Lyons, and Kathy is Assistant Professor of Social Work and Gerontology in the Department of Social Work and Gerontology at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. Kathy's research explores intersections between social work, chaplaincy, spirituality, and culture. And many of you will remember that before joining the faculty at St. Mary's, Kathy was the first project coordinator for Transforming Chaplaincy, and we're delighted to be collaborating with you again, Kathy, in the exciting launch of this research network. And joining Kathy in co-convening the network is Sarah McAvoy. Sarah served as a licensed nursing home administrator for over 35 years, and as a second career, she's working toward board certification as a healthcare chaplaincy. Sarah is a graduate of the Clinical Scholars Program at Maine Medical Center in Portland, and she holds a Master's of Divinity degree from Liberty Theological Seminary and a Juris Doctorate from Western State University College of Law. Sarah, Kathy, we're really excited to be launching the network and really excited to have this webinar today. Let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, George, for your warm introduction. And thank you, Andy, for all you've done today to make today possible. It is an honor to co-convene this network with Sarah. And it is such an exciting opportunity for us to build research, education, and practice connections among chaplains and colleagues in older adult care. To show you the power of networking, I met today's speaker, Dr. Kelly O'Shea Carney, through a connection at St. Mary's College where I work. Our contact thought we needed to meet because of our shared interest in dementia care. I was hoping she could be a guest speaker in one of my undergrad courses, but when I heard about her work, my colleagues and I thought she would be perfect for our inaugural webinar in our new network. To highlight just a few details from her impressive bio, Dr. Carney has worked in the elder care industry for over 20 years. She's a licensed psychologist with certification in geropsychology and specialized experience in the field of dementia. We're excited to have her present today on Spirit Alive, an evidence-based approach for providing spiritual care with those with advanced dementia. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you, Kathy. Thanks. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you here today. And as I shared in my first conversation with Kathy and George and Sarah this morning, this is a topic very near and dear to my heart. Of all the things that I have had the pleasure of working on in my career, truly Spirit Alive and thinking about the spiritual well-being of people with dementia is perhaps I think the most important of the things that we've done. So as I get started, I do want to notice here that we are talking today about people living with dementia. Sometimes we refer to these things as just dementia related topics, but the focus here is on the people who have this disease, and remembering that when people are diagnosed with dementia, frequently they may live for 7 to 10 years with that diagnosis. So people do truly live with this disease and the complications it presents for their lives, and to think about how we can support them and their spiritual well-being through this long journey that they're on is critically important. Andrew, would you go to the next slide, please? So the goals of our program today, I really want to start and make sure that we are understanding one another and kind of on the same page with our terms. We're going to talk about this concept of dementia and the kinds of cognitive changes it creates. And in particular, I really want to spend some time talking about both the losses, which we're all very aware of, but also I want to talk a great deal about the strengths that remain, because that is how we can provide the best pastoral care to these folks. In addition, we're going to talk about how do we harness those preserved strengths in a way that's going to foster spirituality and really enhance that quality of life for people living with dementia. And to that end, I will be talking with you specifically about this evidence-based model that Kathy mentioned called Spirit Alive. And I do want to give a special word of thanks here to my friends at Phoebe Ministries, where we first developed the Spirit Alive model, and I want to thank them for lending their support so that we could share this with you today. Andy, next slide, please. So as we begin, as I said, I want to make sure we're on the same page with our terms. So people often ask me, what's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease? And I like to describe it this way. Dementia is a sort of umbrella term, meaning it covers a variety of specific diagnoses. Dementia basically means that there is some kind of disease going on in the brain that is creating changes in cognitive ability and changes in day-to-day function. But there are a number of different diagnoses that can cause these changes. Of course, we've all heard of Alzheimer's disease. That is the most common form of dementia, but there's also vascular dementia. And frankly, the research is now telling us that Alzheimer's disease and vascular changes probably go hand in hand for most people. There's also Lewy body dementia, which has a sort of Parkinsonian look to it, as well as some memory loss and cognitive changes like Alzheimer's. There's frontotemporal lobe dementias, which has a real impact on the way people behave and their ability to kind of manage the way they interact with others in the world, and there's many others still. Regardless of the kind of dementia we're talking about, the disease progresses through stages. So it begins actually in the preclinical stages where there are not even any symptoms yet, but the disease process is taking hold. In time, then the brain changes enough that we see the early stage, the mild changes, and then through moderate and severe. So that disease progress is important to keep in mind as we talk about how to support people's spiritual well-being, because we need to know something about where are they at in that progression. Now, in a moment, we're going to share a video with you. This is one of my favorite videos, takes about 3 minutes, but it's going to describe to you the disease progression of Alzheimer's. And again, that's considered to be the most common form of dementia. But I want you to pay attention to how these changes take place over time and how it's linked to the specific deterioration in the brain. And Andrew, if I could trouble you to start that video for us, please. So as you can see from that video, there is a fairly logical, typical progression to Alzheimer's disease in terms of the losses that we expect. And Andy, I'm going to ask you to go actually to 2 slides up, skip past the video and go to the next one, please. Thank you. So the video oftentimes leaves people feeling very sad because it sounds like this disease progression is going to be very difficult and involve a lot of losses. And in fact, we know that it does. But I also want to say to you, that is not the whole story. The reality is that for everything that is lost, there is always a strength that remains. And so perspective becomes everything in working with people who are living with dementia. So I love to use these little figure ground illustrations that you see on your slide. And if you look carefully in each one of these images, you ought to be able to see at least 2 images. And if you'd like to, feel free to pop into your chat box the image that you see in when you flip your eyes. But it is an exercise in refocusing your eyes to be able to see not just a chalice, but 2 faces, not just to see a beautiful young woman, but an older woman, a sort of hag, if you will, and not just to see the bear, but to see the raven in the 3rd one. The point is this, is when we're working with people who are living with dementia, we need to become good at shifting our focus. Yes, the losses are there. We need to be educated about those. We need to be aware of those, but we need to be able to do the flipping with our eyes so that we can also see the strengths, because that is how we harness the person who's living with dementia. This is how we reach them at their deepest level, is by identifying the strengths. Andy, would you go to the next slide, please? So I want to talk with you just briefly about an example of this, and I'm going to focus on the mid stage of Alzheimer's disease. This would be the stage at which we might see people in our care settings, because typically they need 24-hour care, they need supervision, they need support. So we might see them in assisted living or a memory care or even a skilled care setting. And on the one side of the slide, you see the weaknesses listed, and these are the same weaknesses that you saw being described in that video that are related to the progression of the disease. But on the other side of the slides are the strengths that remain. So for example, people who are in the middle stage of the disease, the body still remembers. They have incredible motor skills. If somebody was a good cook most of their life, they still know something about moving in a kitchen. If somebody knew how to do woodworking, they probably can still do a little bit in working with wood. These long-term motor skills, playing the piano is another example, but the body remembers. We want to capitalize on that. Long-term memory tends to be very much intact. So I may not remember what I had for lunch, but I can tell you something about my childhood or what it was like to raise my family. Communication skills, it is the verbal skills that are lost, and yet there's other communication skills that remain. People often are still able to read written word long into the later stages of the disease. We just stop asking them to read. Also, nonverbal communication skills are very strong. Even in the very latest stages of dementia, people are still able to read facial expression and emotion, which is why the way we interact with them is so very important. Social skills are good. You've probably heard the stories of somebody in the middle stages where an acquaintance comes by and says hello, and they're like, oh, they are doing good. And the family's like, oh my goodness, you have no idea how much this person is struggling. But they still have that ability to engage in some social chit chat and in that kind of rhythm of social interaction. And similarly, functional skills will remain. People can still set a table. People might still be able to make their bed. They can still do some of those things they've done for a lifetime. The strengths are the things we're going to harness when we think about how to engage these individuals in pastoral care. Next slide, please. So we all know the kinds of challenges that we face in traditional faith-based settings, whether it is a worship service or possibly even a faith-sharing group. What we tend to find is that people who are in these middle to later stages of dementia, they may have trouble paying attention, they may have trouble following what we're saying, they may have trouble filtering what they say or managing their own behavior in that context. And part of that is because traditional faith-based services and traditional approaches to pastoral care are actually drawing more on the weaknesses that are present in mid to late stage dementia. Most specifically, they tend to be very verbally laden. And you heard in that video that verbal skills are some of the earlier skills that start to be disrupted with disease progression. But when God closes a door, he opens a window. And the window is these strengths that are offered. And so there are approaches that we can use that are very engaging and appropriate and meaningful to people who are in the middle to late stages of dementia. It's just that we have to bring these into our pastoral care environments rather than relying upon our traditional approaches to pastoral care. Next slide, please. So as we think about this invitation to see differently, to focus on strengths rather than weaknesses, I invite you to reflect on the beautiful passage from Ezekiel 37. And it's when God asks, "Son of man, can these bones live?" And here's what I ask you to reflect upon as you consider this opportunity we're presenting to you, is that what the world perceives as lifeless, when people of faith have eyes to see, when we can appreciate the potential that is there, and when we act on the convictions of our beliefs of what it is we see, our vision, miracles can happen. So I invite you to think about these folks with the mid to late stage disease that the rest of the world may be thinking really cannot participate in an active spiritual life, that maybe they cannot participate in small group faith sharing or worship services. I'm going to invite you to think about what Ezekiel says to us about that and how we might be able to use our ability to see the potential in what others perceive as lifeless and to really help bring new life into that setting. Next slide, please. So, keeping in mind the specific kinds of strengths that we have talked about that remain in the middle and even into those later stages of dementia, I want to talk with you about the kinds of tools and strategies that will harness those strengths and allow you to provide a very meaningful spiritual faith-sharing experience with the people that you are serving. And what I'm describing here are really, this is the evidence base here. We are drawing from the evidence that comes from the background of psychology, some of it from the rehab world, certainly some of it from chaplaincy, some of it a little bit theologically driven. And I want to share with you the evidence base around what are the tools, what are the strategies that we can use that will allow us to work effectively in a really engaging way with people who have mid to late stage dementia and to support their spiritual well-being. So I'm going to break out each of these boxes individually and talk with you about those. So in our Spirit Alive model in particular, which you're going to see a video about that in just a moment, but in Spirit Alive in particular, what we do is we convene small faith-sharing groups, really small groups, never more than 6 people in a room, because then you start to lose that ability to reach each person individually. And what we do is we bring in these specific tools and strategies in a way that creates almost like a worship service or very much a faith sharing experience. And we begin by selecting a wisdom story. And that wisdom story could come from scripture, it might come from fables, it might even come from a more familiar poem. But what we're looking for here is wisdom stories that convey a great spiritual truth and a truth in particular that's going to be meaningful and important to somebody who is living with mid to late stage dementia. So for example, wisdom stories that convey the idea that God loves you, that convey the idea that all is well, that conveys the idea that we are a community and we care for one another. The faith story that I will use as an example today is the 23rd Psalm, very familiar to most older adults and a great jumping off place for the kind of techniques that we're talking about. But what we do with this wisdom story is we engage with the people living with dementia in the telling and the experiencing of the story in ways that are personally meaningful for them. We bring props into the room when we share these wisdom stories, and I have a few of my props with me here today. Please don't laugh at me, but I actually do keep a little basket of fuzzy sheep that I use when we are breaking out the word from the 23rd Psalm. And it's this kind of prop, something you can hold, something you can touch, something you can cuddle, that helps to bring that 23rd Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, helps to bring it to life. We also bring in props like pictures, and so a picture of the Good Shepherd could be very helpful. We could bring in a little pot of grass so that when we talk about lying down in green pastures, people can feel the grass. The point is this: you choose your props for the purpose of bringing the story to life. We want people to experience this breaking out of the word. Also, so important to bring symbols in. Remember, language is declining. So when we use symbols, symbols that speak to the heart, symbols that speak to our soul and go beyond words, that's very meaningful. So whether it is a cross or a menorah or a statue of some kind, whatever faith tradition people come from, we want to bring the appropriate symbols into that setting. And we use that to help convey the fact that we are in sacred space together, that we are gathered here for the purpose of being in the presence of God and sharing our faith together. It's also really important to think about sensory stimulation. Remember what I said, the body remembers. Even if the mind doesn't, the body remembers. And so, for example, bringing in scents and aromas that are familiar, a little packet of lavender the individual can smell, maybe a bread machine in the background baking bread, and that scent is with us. Things that people can hold and touch. Again, the stuffed animals. If we're talking about Joseph and the many-colored cloak, maybe we wrap a cloak around the individual so that they can feel what it means to be wrapped and held in something warm. We can bring flowers in, the visual of the flowers, the pictures, the music. We want to speak to the body. This must be an embodied experience. We cannot rely just on words, because words is where we use people. Music is also critically important. And so here's where part of the evidence base comes in. I don't know if you realized, but music and the memory of music is actually stored in a different part of the brain from where we encode other memories. And that's why it's so accessible even in the later stages of dementia. So bringing in music that people can listen to, songs that people can share in the singing of. And remember how I said people are able to read? We can give people a large print, large font song sheet for songs that are familiar to them, and they can read along with the words and make that part of their worship experience or their expression of love as they sing along. So music should be part of every one of these interactions because it is remembered and it is accessible. Also, remember what I said about people maintain some functional abilities, reading being one of those. Anything that we can put down on paper, whether it's maybe a few passages. I, for example, have typed up the first few lines of the 23rd Psalm in large print. We want to make it so people can read it. It needs to be properly spaced and large print, but don't assume that people cannot read. So whether it's a prayer, or the wisdom story you're using, or the song that you're introducing, we can invite people to use their retained ability by making sure that it's in a large print and easy for them to access. Next slide, please. The other thing that is so important, again, in the spirit of making this an embodied experience, drawing upon movement. You know, there is this vast vocabulary of nonverbal spiritual language expressed in movement, and it could include everything from raising our arms together to putting our hands together in a prayer sign of the cross for those of us for whom that's familiar. It could involve bowing, whatever those movements are that will speak to both the religious tradition of the individual and allow them to express themselves without words. We want to bring that movement into the experience. In addition to that, we really want to invite active participation. So if this is a small group setting that you're considering, think about the strengths of the individual members. Is there someone who can help to set a sort of altar or a visual setting that creates that sense of sacred space? Can they help to set up? Can they light the candles? Can they pass out the song sheets? Do you have people who are strong readers? Then ask them to read what you've put on the page from that scripture or whatever story you're using. If someone's still a good singer, ask them to lead in the song. We want to convey the message to these folks who in most of their life are feeling a sense of purposelessness and uselessness, that they are needed, that they are valued parts of the community, and they are able to contribute. We also want to invite reminiscence. And so as we're breaking open whatever wisdom story you've chosen, we're inviting people to reminisce about that. So if I'm telling the story of the Good Shepherd, and I know that one of the people who's joined us today used to be a farmer, we're going to invite those reminiscences about what is it like to take care of real sheep. They're a little stinkier than these soft, fuzzy sheep that we're holding. And what's it like to muck out a stall and to feed them or to find a lost sheep? And we want to use the reminiscence from people's own life story as a way to help these wisdom stories touch them at a much, much deeper level than the simple telling of the story can do. Again, throughout this interaction, you can tell it's very interactive, it's very embodied. There's a lot of participation, a lot of back and forth. This is not the chaplain doing the leading. This is the chaplain doing the inviting and the participants really offering much of the content. But in doing so, try to draw upon the songs or the prayers or the stories that are most familiar to people. And you certainly know that for the people that you're working with. What are the things that are going to speak to their heart that are so well known? In my own Catholic faith tradition, certainly an Our Father, a Hail Mary, and some of the familiar songs from church would be most welcome. You will know your people and choose well for who they are. Again, as we talked about, this really should be small group. We have this horrible tendency sometimes of treating our pastoral care as if it were an activity, and we load lots of people in the room, and that's one of the worst things that we can do when we're interacting with people living with dementia, is because the more that is going on in this space, the more distracted they will become. They have more difficulty sustaining their attention. So gathering people in small groups is a helpful way to keep the quiet down. Ideally in an environment where you can close a door, ideally in an environment that it's the same every time, because the body remembers, and that familiarity then will start to feel like spiritual home to these folks. This can also all be done on an individual level, but if you're going to do it in a group, keep it small and keep that environment controlled and help it to feel like sacred space. And then finally, I want to emphasize again how very, very important it is that this experience be personalized for each individual. So before you even try any of this, it's so helpful to learn the life story of each individual who will be participating in this with you. And that's what's going to allow you to draw out the reminiscence, to pull on those strengths for the active participation. And that is also what's going to allow the individuals in this group to get to know one another. And you know, they may not remember one another's names, but they will begin to know that they are community to one another. another when we make this a very personalized experience. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do with you now is I would like to share with you a beautiful video that will depict this Spirit Alive model, which is an evidence-based standardized model developed at Phoebe Ministries, which is in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I encourage you to go to their website and look them up. And if you are interested in adopting this model, Phoebe Ministries would be the folks you would reach out to. But what I want to do is I want to share this video now because a picture is worth 1,000 words, and you're going to see all the different aspects of these strategies, of these tools incorporated into interactions in a way that I will help bring it to life. So Andy, whenever you're ready, please start that video. we pause there, please? Thank you. Okay, if you'd like to watch the rest of the video, it is available, and I do know in your handouts, a link to that video has been provided, so I'm sorry to cut it off in the middle, but we do want to leave some time for questions as well. And Andy, if I could trouble you to go 2 slides ahead, we'll skip over that. There we go. No, next one. So I hope that even just that little taste gives you a sense of what this spirit alive experience can be like. And even if you don't formally adopt this model, and again, it is a standardized model which has been developed through a team that I had the pleasure of working with at Phoebe Ministries, and it still is quite alive and well there. So you can reach out to them for the model, but even if you choose not to do that, the various strategies and approaches that we've talked about are things that you can experiment even on your own. And I think you will find that just having that sort of openness to the idea that we can approach pastoral care differently, and again in this way that harnesses the strengths of the individual and speaks to their personal experience. I think what you find is that we really can touch people very deeply, and you can witness firsthand that the spirit is very much alive. And I will tell you, there has never been a time, never, not once, that I have experienced spirit alive that I haven't gotten tears in my eyes. It is moving in the extreme to see the way people truly do come to life in their interactions. And especially for some of our small groups that have been meeting over time and they become familiar with one another, the way they become community to each other is really quite moving. The way people will reach out and touch each other in compassion, or will share a sense of empathy and concern for one another, really can be very beautiful. So when we do these kinds of approaches, just a few quick tips of things you might want to take into account. Again, small groups, please don't make it any larger than 6, 8 at the very, very most. That continuity in the gathering of people is very helpful. I do recommend that as you begin this experience, that you create your sacred space together, that you come prepared with the story, the props, the ideas, the questions you might invite people into, the reminiscences you think you can draw upon. But when you gather in the space, then invite those participants to help either set an altar or a table where some of the props and the symbols and the sensory experiences you're going to use will be gathered, and maybe there's some music playing in the background that puts people in a frame of mind that this is sacred space. And then you simply begin little by little. You break open this story by asking questions, by wondering, by making connections, by passing out props and asking people, what is it like to hold a lamb? What do you think in this lovely picture that I just adore? What do you think Jesus is feeling right there? What is he thinking? What is that lamb thinking? And allow the people you're working with to provide the content, to provide the insights. And that's where the beauty of this model comes in. So I sincerely hope I've given you some good ideas that you can play with, that you can experience and experiment with, and you can't go wrong, quite honestly. Nobody's ever going to be sad if you hand them a fuzzy sheet just to get started. So Andy, could you go to the next slide, please? And what I'd like to do is really want to invite some questions now. And Kathy and Sarah, I think you are going to assist us with managing any questions that might come in.
Yes, thank you so much for this informative presentation. I got a lot out of it. It was very moving. A lot of the questions were practice-oriented questions. And let me start with this one. The asker asked, can you speak about spiritual assessment for people with dementia? And then this asker sometimes struggles to know about the sorts of stories, symbols, and rituals people are familiar with earlier in their lives. And it gets a little more complex than that too, in the sense of if you work in a multicultural post-Christian region. And a related question was, you use the symbols that people are already familiar with.
Mhm. Yeah, so great question. And I cannot emphasize enough how important that spiritual assessment is before you begin using some of these approaches. And you heard it said in the video that actually this is an interdisciplinary approach. And so it's not only helpful to do a spiritual assessment, but to be aware of the other assessments that maybe have been done if you're fortunate enough to be working in a team-based setting, a hospital, a long-term care setting, to look at the other assessments. But number one, it's always helpful to talk to family care partners. They're the ones who may be able to provide some history for you. But I also would not be constrained by what you hear as history. We have had people in Spirit Alive where the family said person never had any interest in faith, never went to church, not part of their lives, but they were interested in joining in some of our most enthusiastic participants. So you want to gather that history so you know what's meaningful. Use the care partner to do it. Also look at the social work history. What did the person do for a living? Maybe you can learn a little bit about their childhood, where they grew up, what their hobbies were. Those would be pieces that you could then bring in to that individualized kind of interaction. You might even ask your rehab team, if you have a rehab team, can this person read? Are they safe to stand up and help set the sacred space for us? Is it okay if I ask them to walk up and down and hand out the song sheets to everybody? So use the whole team to find the strengths, find the history, use the family, the care partners. I will tell you this, most families are so touched and thrilled and delighted that someone is asking about their loved one's spiritual life and their faith history. And often they're really happy to share that. But gather pieces from anywhere you can and then just use that as your jumping off place. And, it depends in terms of the idea of what if you have multiple faiths represented. It kind of depends on where you are and kind of the theological approach to the setting you're in or the people that you're working with. But, in some settings, it'd be just fine to have a statue of Buddha right next to that statue of Jesus. If, oftentimes the people with dementia won't mind if the people around them don't mind. So I would, again, encourage some openness. There could be a real playfulness in this, although being respectful of people's comfort levels.
So having a variety of symbols available and then seeing where it sparks someone's imagination.
Yes, and thank you for saying that, Kathy. That's so important. There's a little trial and error in this too, right? We may find that a symbol or a prop or a prayer does not speak to people in the way we thought it would, but paying attention to, well, what are they responding to, and then how can we build off of that is really important.
It sounds like there's some curiosity from a person or two about working with specific denominations. For example, working with Roman Catholic priests and sisters with Alzheimer's. Do you have experience with Mass in a smaller group setting rather than daily Mass with a larger community?
Yes. Oh, I love that question. So actually, I have done some consulting with some orders of priests and nuns. And if you will allow me, I will share what I noticed in those settings is that often those priests and nuns who had reached a point where they were no longer in active ministry, they often were beautifully cared for in whatever setting they were in, but not as actively engaged in kind of that spiritual life that had been such a foundation for them for their whole lives. So I love the idea of thinking about how can we gather these small groups of priests or sisters, whatever it is. And I would draw in that case very, very heavily on their traditions, on the rituals that are familiar to them, and inviting them to help be the ones that offer those rituals on behalf of the others who are with them. I think in many cases for priests and nuns, the large group worship settings are still going to be appropriate because that is such a lifelong, deeply learned pattern. I suspect that we would not find that they'd have as much trouble simply being present in larger groups, but I think the smaller groups allow them to have a sort of individual spiritual experience that can go well beyond those large groups and meet deeper needs.
That's really helpful. It also gets me thinking about the way what we saw in the video, the progression of the disease. If older memories are some of the last to go, being able to access a priest and a sister from some of their earlier memories of having been ministers,
Yes.
then you can reach them in this way.
Absolutely. And again, cannot emphasize enough how critically important it is for them. You know, this has been a lifelong commitment, and just because they now need care, we don't want to see them abandon or feel abandoned as in their role as people of faith and as ministers in some regard.
Yeah. Well, the next question is related to is there a model or a workbook curriculum that is standard to the program? For example, stories that you use, props to have nearby, ideas to make the stories come alive.
Yes, thank you for asking that question. So for those of you who might be interested, as I said, this model still lives at Phoebe Ministries, and you can reach out to the folks at Phoebe Ministries, and you can inquire about this. And, you know, Kathy, maybe what I'll make sure of is that I'll be sure I give you the email of the gentleman, Scott Brooks Cope, who was pictured in the video. He'd be the primary contact, so I'll make sure you have his email. But what I want you to know is this, is that when this model was developed, it was developed through our Center for Excellence in Dementia Care, and it was, again, very much an evidence-based model and a standardized. So when you decide to adopt the model and license the program, actually what you receive is you receive a manual that breaks out specific wisdom stories and provides you with a sort of script, if you will, that gives you the story and suggested props and suggested questions and prayers and songs and movements. And so you can kind of grab that. We always encourage people to develop their own array of props, which you can use across different kinds of wisdom stories. And there's also training that goes along with that. So Phoebe will also provide the training so that people can really delve into how to use these techniques and do that effectively and productively.
Nice. One of the questions is related to how do we recognize signs of dementia in persons who have not yet been diagnosed with it? Are there signs that chaplains can utilize and look for?
Yes, there certainly are. So, and this is such a great question, because in the world of dementia care, what we are recognizing is that our best opportunity to intervene in dementia is actually in the very earliest stages. And so early identification and early intervention is one of the most helpful things you can do. But mostly what you're going to see with people, part of it depends upon what specific diagnosis is at play, because different diagnoses, they vary the most in the earliest stages. And so the symptom you're most likely to see in the earliest stages is actually a defining feature for different diagnoses. But some of the basic things you may look for are that people are finding it difficult to engage in complex activities of daily living. So things like maybe keeping their checkbook or managing their affairs in the same way. The other thing that we tend to see in very, very early stages is people start becoming a little more rigid. It's because their brain can't quite keep up with the pace of what's happening around them. And so they tend to get a little bit more rigid. They can be kind of frustrated or angry, but it's because they're having trouble processing as quickly as is needed. And again, particularly in more complex situations, in an unfamiliar setting, in a crowded setting with unfamiliar people. So those are some of the things that you might notice. And then of course, all the hallmarks of things like short-term memory loss, some difficulty expressing in language. We see visual spatial skills. People are a little more likely to get lost in space. What I mean by that is, you know, forgetting where you parked your car at the grocery store, which does happen to all of us, but if it happens a lot, then that's a little bit more of a concern.
Kelly, there's another question here that I'd like to pose. It's if someone is not rooted in a religious tradition, what can we do? That kind of spiritual but not religious person.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts there?
Well, honestly, I think we can borrow from many of the same kinds of strategies and approaches that are described, but we may change the content a little bit. So perhaps the wisdom stories we choose would come more from fables or from poetry or just, even Greek mythology is something that we could maybe use to kind of break out pieces of a story. The other thing that I think we would want to do is maybe reframe some of our language. So rather than talking about God, maybe we're talking about love. Maybe we're talking about community. Maybe we're talking about compassion and caring for one another. I trust that we all believe that, we all have a soul that needs tending, and regardless of whether or not there was a faith tradition there is still that very active spiritual piece. And then within that, we can still use all of these same tools, the wondering questions, the reminiscence, the movement, the sensory experience, but we're doing that around a different content.
Thank you for that.
Yes.
Kathy, other questions?
Have you had experience seeing this model used in more of an acute setting where it's kind of a two-part question where the population may change more regularly and or the patients have a comorbid psychiatric diagnosis?
Yeah, so I don't personally have as much experience with that, but I do know that there are individuals who have used these approaches in those acute care or even psychiatric settings. Typically in those settings, and it's because of the fact that your patient population changes so regularly, typically it might be more of a one-on-one kind of interaction. So again, more sort of traditional pastoral care where it's the chaplain working with an individual. And hopefully you're able to grab just a little bit of history from the care partner before you go in to do that visit. And then you might just use a few of these kinds of props. Maybe you'd rely more heavily on music. Maybe there would be one particular prop that you would bring in with you, something that's interactive and you can talk about. The other thing, quite frankly, that's very effective is sometimes walk into the person's room and see what's already in their room. Sometimes people will bring things with them, whether it's pictures of family or bits of nature in the form of flowers or plants. And sometimes we can use what's already there as a basis for this interaction to just kind of break out what's important to this individual.
That's really helpful. Do you have any experience or any thoughts on how to offer communion to those who are unable to swallow or chew?
That I think I'd have to refer you to my friends in OT for. I think the swallow experts would be the ones I would ask about. Yeah, I don't know that I could answer that.
With about 4 minutes left, I think is it time for us to move to the what am I trying to say? Announcements of upcoming events.
Yes, please. Yes.
Actually, Kelly, is there anything else you have to wrap up? Any other slides in your presentation or things that you want to share?
The only other thing I was going to share is I have given folks my email here. Feel free to reach out if I can be helpful to you. And also I did want to mention that we have a group spiritual direction for healthcare leaders that's forming. So if people are interested in that, you can reach out. So thanks, Sarah.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
And that's on one of the ending slides, that information about that you just talked about.
Yes.
Yeah. Kelly, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. You inspire and inform us as to what is possible in the care of people living with dementia. We're so grateful that you were part of our inaugural elder care research education offering. So thank you very much, very much.
Thank you.
Deeply grateful. I wanted to share some other information about Transforming Chaplaincy and the other research networks available. If you log on to Transforming Chaplaincy, there are research incubator networks in all sorts of different areas. Chaplaincy functions, chronic illness, hospice and palliative spiritual care. These offer similar things to what we're doing. So I encourage you to check them out on the Transforming Chaplaincy website. Andy, can you move forward? So very excited to introduce our next offering of the Elder Care Research Network. We are going to be hosting a 1-hour session with professor, researcher, theologian John Swinton. He'll be joining us from Scotland, and he'll be talking a little bit from his book, Dementia, Living in the Memories of God. His title is there, and we encourage you to register for that program. It is April 29th from 1 to 2. We'll also be able to offer a code so that you can log into Erdman's, the publisher, and get a copy of the book if you're interested at a discounted rate. So we're really excited to be able to offer that for you. If we've piqued your interest about research at all or being part of our network, I know that Andy wants to talk a little bit about the research literacy programs. The research literacy courses 101 and 102 can offer you an introduction to research or a much deeper dive. So Andy, did you want to share a little bit about that?
Right. The slides that you're seeing ahead of you, 101 and 102, are incredible online asynchronous courses, so you can take them when you've got the time to take the actual course, although they're offered at particular times over periods of time with very engaged instructors that are all Transforming Chaplaincy Templeton Fellows. And I also wanted to scroll back to our very next webinar that Transforming Chaplaincy is hosting on from our palliative care folks that Paul Gauchut is putting together. So that's on March 15th. All of these links that are on all these slides are located in the handouts, which you can download. Those are available at the bottom of your control panel. So no need to be, quickly writing down these links or getting lost amid our website. All those links, including the links that Kelly pointed out to you in the YouTube, those will all be provided for you. And then lastly, we have our, God willing, in-person summer camp, which is basically the content of 101 and 102 together, on site at Rush. Dr. Fitchett's going to be leading that. We have this amazing faculty, Kate Peterman, Beth Muehlhausen, Allison Delaney, also another former Transforming Chaplaincy Templeton Fellow. That's going to be July 11th to the 15th. On site at Rush. We'll be testing and taking all precautions that we can, but this is a real thrill. We weren't able to have it in 2020. We weren't able to have it in 2021. So I know Dr. Fitchett, myself, and a bunch of other people are really thrilled to bring this back in 2022. So again, links are there. Links are in the handout. Encourage you to take a look if you're able to join us. And that is it.
So thank you all very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing your name in the registration for the Elder Care Research Network. We will be announcing our first gathering of folks who are interested in being part of the network. So we hope that you'll join us. Kathy?
Thank you very much. So glad you could join with us today in this wonderful inaugural event for us. Hope you have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Dr. Carney.
Thank you.